It's always a challenging task managing your supervisor. But I always start with a little story just to highlight that sometimes things in life don't come as we expect them to come, and pursuing a PhD and a career in general, not necessarily only an academic career, requires a lot of flexibility and resilience. So there was this little boy that wanted to become a lawyer originally, and apologies to the lawyers in the room, but his father realized that probably that wasn't a good choice for them. And the reason that little boy wanted to become a lawyer was because when he was growing up, and I'm about to tell my age now, in the Greek television there was these famous shows of lawyers of New York where you would see them all suited up and dressed well and walking into courtrooms, a bit like the Wolf of Wall Street, driving posh cars and things like that. And you're really impressed if you're, 6, 7, 8 years old. That's the lifestyle I want. And the boy's father basically said to him one day, well, I've got an appointment with a lawyer. Why don't you join me just to ask a few questions about, the work they do? So we went to this meeting, and the guy that turned up, had his shirt outside his trousers. He was clearly not the icon model I had in mind. And he said, well, I do most of the day paperwork. So I thought, well, I need to run out of here. And so I did. And then, what's your next choice? Oh, my next choice would be to be a businessman. And I want to go and finish with my degree and go and work for a few years and then go and do an MBA. My dream of life was going and doing an MBA at INSEAD in Fontainebleau in France. And I did my undergraduate studies, finished them, and a friend of mine said to me, well, why don't you stay doing a master's? Let's do a master's together in the same department as we did the undergraduate. And said, well, that doesn't necessarily fit with what I want to achieve. And said, well, it's going to give you some additional skills and things like that. So I was converted. I stayed, did my master's. Finishing my master's, I found a supervisor who then became later on my PhD supervisor. And she said to me, well, we did a nice dissertation. We were looking at the market exchange, the stock exchange reaction on the way companies were announcing investments abroad, becoming multinationals. I spent the summer in the Bank of Greece, kind of finding announcements. There was a daily report of Athens Stock Exchange, was obviously not electronic those days. So I had to go physically every day and go through the whole of the report, collecting the information, putting them down. We eventually managed to publish actually that dissertation. And towards the end of that dissertation, my supervisor said, well, there might be a scholarship from the European Union. Would you like to stay behind and do a PhD? In my mind, that was never my intention. But again, I was converted. So I started doing my PhD, and in the first year of my PhD, I suddenly lost my father. My dad used to have his own personal company. He was effectively doing needles, gloves, things that, retrospectively thinking, if I've kept the company during COVID, I would have been multi-million rich. But nobody else in the family wanted to maintain the business. Nobody in the family had the expertise and experience. He was a chemical engineer. I was an economist. Economists tend to be very poor at business and management. So I had to stop for almost a year, wind up the company, take care of the family, and continue with the PhD. Eventually finished the PhD, but it took me slightly longer. A lot of people might have said, well, somebody would have stopped at that point and, gone and follow a very different route. And as I was finishing my PhD, my main issue was that throughout my education, I never left Greece. I did my undergraduate, master's, and PhD in exactly the same department of Athens University of Economics and Business. So if you see my wall behind me, you've got 3 degrees that look almost identical next to each other. And it was always like, well, I've never been exposed myself to the world. I'd like to do something. I was fortunate enough to have a supervisor that was from the University of Reading. So in Greece, you've got 3 supervisors. The main supervisor was the one I did my dissertation for the master's. The other supervisor was an econometrician. I survived that. And my third supervisor was someone who was working at the University of Reading, and therefore my whole PhD was written in English. And I said, okay, let's give it a chance. Let's try. So I started making applications the last 6 months of my PhD. I started making applications. Got no response from no university. Now, just to tell you, those days, applications were not, I'll go online and submit my application and I'll upload some of my transcripts. You had to effectively print 7, 8 copies of your CV, 7, 8 copies of your personal statement, put them in an envelope, and send them through surface mail to the other country. I've made several applications and I never heard from anybody. So I remember it was Glasgow that I said, I'll pick up the phone. I need to get some feedback. Why my applications don't get shortlisted? Because I had publications at that point. And the lady that picked up the phone said, well, tell me your name and I'll look into it. So a couple of minutes later, she said, well, your application was not eligible. I said, what do you mean it was not eligible? Well, it turned up here, a couple of days after the deadline. But as I said, I've sent it by the deadline, the stamp of the post office was by the deadline. He said, no, actually, we need to receive your application by the deadline. And my cultural background in Greece is when you want to meet a deadline is the post office stamp. Once you put the post office stamp there, you meet the deadline. Now, oblivious myself, didn't know that. So I was missing all opportunities, and unless I had that conversation with that lovely lady from Glasgow, I would know. So I started following a very different strategy, sending my application earlier. Eventually, University of Kent offered me a job interview. I left Athens with a hand luggage because I was going to stay a day in Canterbury. Turned up in the bed and breakfast, Alexandra House in Roper Road, I still remember that. Opened up the hand luggage, all my shampoo was on my shirt. The lady that was the landlady said, okay, give me your shirt, I'll have it ready tomorrow morning. So next morning, my shirt was clean, ironed, everything like that. Went through the interview, they said, we'll let you know. I left UK, went back to Athens, and then went to Stockholm for the Academy of International Business Conference. And on my return from Stockholm, there was an email. We then had emails. It was the beginning, but we still had emails. There was an email waiting for me saying, we want to offer you the job. Could you give us a call back? A few days before the closing ceremony of the Athens Olympic, here I am with 2 big suitcases, on a flight to the UK, to the unknown. I could go on for ages. I can tell you the story of my career and how I got to the point I am today. And people, turn and they say, oh, professor, University of Essex, SENSS director, everything has been planned. The truth is far from that. A lot of the time, you just need to grab whatever opportunity comes your way and run with it. A lot of the time, you will have to balance difficult, challenging situations. A lot of the time, people will beat you and you will have to come back up. People will say very nasty words about your work because that's the role of the reviewers, and you will have to stand back up and say, no, I'll fight and I'll go. And the PhD is a process like that. It is a 4-year period where there is going to be a lot of ups, but probably a lot of downs. There's going to be a lot of shiny days and a lot of dark, cloudy days. And it has to be through your internal strength and through your motivation that you need to find the energy to come back up and continue and move on and enjoy, you know, in the past days, you know, you would only enjoy an acceptance letter from a journal. Now we've learned to enjoy revise and resubmit. And if you get a revise and resubmit from a 4-star journal, it is actually something to enjoy and celebrate, because you don't get that many revise and resubmits. So every single opportunity you've got there for the next 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 years, if you're on a part-time route, take advantage of it. Don't leave it there. Take every opportunity comes your way. Make use of everything that we can offer you, from your researcher training support grant, from our induction event, from our annual conference. Talk to others, draw that energy from others, and maintain those community links and relationships, because you can support each other throughout this period. To go back, actually, 6 months into my PhD, we found out that I wasn't eligible for the studentship. So I didn't actually get the studentship. I had to self-fund, and I had to work at the same time in order to be able to kind of maintain my living standard and do the PhD. Now, in this whole period, there is a very crucial person in the process, which is the supervisor. And good or bad, a supervisor can guide you. I'm talking about good or bad in terms of links and alignment of characters. Obviously, most of you have already started having a working relations with your supervisor. There are very different supervisory styles. There are very different ways you can think about the supervisor. And what I'm about to do in the next 45 minutes is basically not tell you how to manage your supervisor, because I said there's nobody who can actually tell you. You know, there are people that have extremely good relationships with the supervisor. You've got one right at the back of the room, Dr. Sesnat. We were talking about it the other day. She took her supervisor to the A&E and spent a few hours with her supervisor. And you've got people like myself, that I had a big fight with my supervisor a few years back on the back of a publication, and we don't talk to each other anymore. I took my revenge when we applied for the same job, and I actually got the job. Right. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say a few words about how to identify what kind of supervisor you have, how and why the supervisor is required to do certain things, so you can understand, you know, sometimes where their demands on your time are coming from, and how do you actually become aware of that relationship you're building and how you can move forward. And there is this very interesting article in Times Higher Education a few years back. They keep kind of updating it. It's called Monsters and Mentors, PhD Disasters and How to Avoid Them. The presentation will be there for you to read it. But what it has a few interesting stories on how different supervisors and different students might be kind of behaving. You will see the paper, the article goes back to 2017, and as I said, there is quite a lot of updates every now and then. But there are 3 kind of PhD nightmares, and sometimes I keep that article at the back of my mind when I have supervisory meetings with my students, and when I see them, you know, down, and you know, they say, oh, it's been challenging. I said, look, you could have had this type of supervisor as well. All right? So you can always draw kind of inspiration from that, how bad you can be as a supervisor to your students. So it's going to be there for you to read. As I said, very interesting stories. Read this statement: I had never felt so helpless in my life. The university wholly and blindly supported my supervisors, ignored my concerns, and suggested again that I was making things up. Okay? So things can go horribly, horribly wrong in that sense. So what I'm hoping I will be able to do is help you identify the early signs of things going horribly, horribly wrong, and kind of try to avoid them. So I'll start with a few remarks on the nature of the PhD, who is a supervisor, what is the motivation of supervisors. I'll talk about the changes we had to the doctoral education over the years, and explain where we are with the PhD these days, and then talk a bit about the relationship between a student and a supervisor. And I've got a task for you in between, simply just to give you the chance to talk to each other. So historically, and by the way, a lot of that is also material that I'm using when I do training for supervisors. When I was at Kent, I was responsible for the module which was part of the postgraduate certificate in higher education, kind of developing as a PhD supervisor. So I'm giving you the other side of the coin. The qualification to supervise was to be active in research. So if you were active in research, you were qualified to supervise a student. There was nothing else that was effectively required. And in order to be an effective supervisor, you need to be an effective researcher and an effective supervisor. But nobody was there to kind of think and prepare those poor supervisors about how do you actually train someone to become an effective researcher. Yes, you yourself, you can become an effective researcher. It could take a lot of years to become an effective researcher. You could make a lot of errors. But then how do you actually pass that on? How do you think about developing another individual to become an effective researcher? And one way of equipping effective researchers to be effective supervisors is for them to take appropriate professional development. So these last few years, we all talk about supervisor training. When it comes to supervisor training, don't think of it as in a very formal way necessarily. When you train supervisors, it's not simply you stand in front of them and tell them, look, this is how you need to supervise, but it's more about creating a safe space where they can share best practices or poor practices equally, challenging studentships, and help them understand how to effectively manage the relationship from their perspective. So again, there is no magic wand to wave and say, oh, you become an effective supervisor, or I'll teach you to become an effective supervisor. It's more about experience and sharing that experience. And this is why a lot of the institutions nowadays, in their code of practice, they don't allow early career researchers to become supervisors on their own. You usually have a combination. And this is why a lot of the time we no longer talk about the supervisor. So in essence, my title is wrong. You're not talking about the supervisor, you're talking about the supervisory team. A team of individuals that might have very different skills, and they can support you throughout the journey. Obviously, yes, you will have someone who is leading that journey. So in some countries, this is required by state, like France and Poland. You have this habilitation, where you be trained to become a supervisor, and in others like the Australia and the UK, you've got the government steering institutions, you've got independent organizations like the UK Council for Graduate Education. They now created a scheme about supervisor recognition, where they enable you to think about, share best practice, write about your experience, reflect on that experience, and how you can become better in supporting students. So on one hand, you've got a move away from what it used to be a master apprenticeship kind of framework, where the supervisor knew everything and you gradually trained the apprentice through asking them to do things for you. But on the other hand, you also have a change in the nature of the PhD. And I don't need to go back many years. I can simply talk about the change between the previous call from the SRC and this call from the SRC when we were developing SENSS. The previous call from the SRC was simply about academic, training, development, but in an academic framework. The new call from the SRC required each and every one of you to undertake a 3-month placement. They don't do it because they want to torture you. They want to do it because in reality, when you think about your careers, you should be able to have all your options open. And what I always say to students is, it doesn't actually matter, what you're going to do, as long as whatever choice you make gives you routes into multiple destinations. Because you want then, at the end of the day, you to have the option to say, look, this is what I want to do, not being enforced on you. So the nature of the PhD has changed, and it has gone simply from, okay, I'll teach you how to do it, and then you will be left on your own, but also you will be doing something which has to do with the creation of knowledge and in an academic framework, to effectively a training journey that should enable the researcher to develop skills that are what I would call transferable skills. Skills that you can apply to a number of different career destinations. Skills that will enable you to think about not only the next paper publication, but also how that publication might translate into policy. Or the other way around, reading a publication and then transferring it into policy from your perspective. So that's the change of the nature of the PhD, and obviously that has forced the change of the supervisor skills. It's very difficult. It's very different for someone to say, okay, I'll supervise you, and I'll supervise you in an academic manner and will generate, this contribution to knowledge that we expect you to do your PhD. I'll teach you how to do publications, respond to reviewers, and that's it. It's not only that. Now the supervisors need to have multiple skills. They need to be able to also talk to you about engagement. They need to be able to talk to you about impact. They need to be able to transfer all that knowledge and help you in reality become self-aware. So the supervisor and that relationship between the student and the supervisor has actually changed. And what I always say my supervisees is, at the end of the day, when will we find out that you are better than I am? At the point where your command of the literature and your command of your subject is better than my command. And that's really, really important. The expectation from my supervisees is that eventually they will become better than what I am, to the point where throughout my last years of my career, the last few years of my career, my main fear was that some of my supervisees might get promoted to professor before I get promoted to professor. And that was almost about to happen. Beat them. Right, so the changes in doctoral education are the driving force between the change in that relationship between the supervisor and the supervisee. And there are a number of changes over the years, and I'll focus on some of them. First of all is the growth, diversification, and welfare of the student population body. If you look at the room around you, you will see a much more diversified group of individuals, coming not only from different nationalities, different backgrounds, different experiences in life, different kind of aspirations for their career, but also very different skill sets. And it's no longer kind of a degree that would do people that would belong in an elite and nobody else would be able to do. It's also the case of diversification of purposes. The PhD is no longer simply the creation of academic knowledge, but it's this training program that needs to develop those transferable skills. Diversification of modes of study. You've got part-time, you've got full-time, you've got professional doctorates, you've got a lot of different things there that might service different purposes. And at the same time, you've got what we call a formalization. It's no longer acceptable to allow the supervisor to simply say, okay, I'll tell you what you need to do, and you will do it. And at the end, you will get your PhD. There is a formal way of training. The student journey that you've talked earlier with Mark and Felicity, the opportunities, the skills that you develop, all these are part of that formalization. There is a framework these days. You're not thinking, oh, what do I need to do? And that framework, if I go back, it's very nicely pictured by the researcher development framework from Vitae, with the 4 domains and the skills that you need to develop to become an effective researcher. And it gives you the opportunity to kind of self-reflect. And obviously, when you start thinking about all these things, I've got an example of the commodification here. And what does it mean? There are two very nice quotes. 1980s, the sad experience that I went through in the 1980s when I undertook a part-time PhD. Little contact with my supervisor, except when they send them draft chapters with limited feedback. Fed up with, after 4 years, encouraged to continue. It was okay to continue. You know, it could take ages to complete your PhD, 6, 7, 8 years. You know, my home institutions in Greece, they use, shall I dare saying it, sometimes the PhDs are slaves. You know, you write the papers, you do the teaching, you mark the scripts of your supervisor. You know, there is not necessarily a formal framework there. I had a viva without any preparation, information what to expect. You know, you lead the lamb to the slaughter there. And the only thing I remember about the viva was the external examiner asked if I had included such a long, why I had included such a long appendix. I was awarded a master's without any feedback as to why, and the supervisor never made any further contact with me. So, and there was no appeal procedure. You know, it was more like, oh yeah, we'll get you in. If you're lucky enough to get out, you will get out. And that has changed a lot. You've got here a quote from the Office of the Independent Adjudicator in 2009, where the university was unable to provide any records of supervision. There was no meeting. The supervisor had no successful supervisions of the PhD, and the university had failed to demonstrate that it complied with the normal levels of supervision. And of course, you know, the student got awarded compensation for the poor quality. Now, obviously, I'm not suggesting you will get to that point, but one of the issues here you might get is that all of those things are being done for an administration point of view. The reality is far from that. You know, when I have supervision meetings with my supervisees, the reason I ask them to have detailed records of that meeting is not because I want to safeguard myself from any appeal, but because I want to have what we would have in computers, a reset point. You know, if something goes wrong and if the student or myself start contradicting each other, I then say to them, look, let's go back to that point. So imagine, you know, you have a computer, you do the usual upgrades. Something goes wrong with one of those upgrades, you need to go back and revert to a previous version of the operating system. It's exactly that process. You've got a point where you can return back to and start again from there and find out what has gone wrong in the process. Okay? And the earlier you could do it, and this is why we usually require to have monthly meetings, the earlier you do it, the easier it is to find the answer to the problem. If you leave it for 6 months' time and come back to your supervisor, it might be much more difficult. If you're struggling for 6 months' time and you haven't told us, there's going to be an issue. I think Felicity mentioned quite a few times, and if she hasn't, I will mention it a few times, that in the first instance where something goes wrong, tell us. We're not here to punish you. We're not here to withdraw funding. We're here to support you and make sure that we give you everything you need in order to complete that journey. The earlier you tell us about issues you might be having, the easier it will be for us to rectify. The longer you leave it and you put things underneath the carpet, the more difficult it will be for us. And we've dealt with challenging cases over the years, so believe me, there's nothing we haven't seen yet. So in terms of measures of commodification, in the UK in the 80s, the state research funders introduced target completion rates, penalties. So we, as SENSS, we have institutions that need to maintain a level of completions. If those institutions don't maintain that level of completions, they get penalized. They can't get any more funding from the ESRC. You've got in Sweden in 1988, there was this 4-year legal limit of funding, which was introduced in Norway. Targets for PhD completion within 6 years. In Spain, degree limiting the completion date for a doctor to 5 years. We moved away from, someone is going into the university and, well, they will finish whenever they will finish. Because by the time you finish your PhD 10 years later, what you have produced will probably be redundant. The way knowledge is moving at this point, and the way knowledge will be moving with artificial intelligence and technology and new methodological approaches, I already feel that I'm redundant. If you ask me to compete with someone like yourselves with all the new methodological techniques, I'll raise my hands up and say, I'm sorry, I won't be able to do that. And therefore, I will never compete with you, I will cooperate with you. Okay? So that's quite important. And of course, part of that, there was this introduction of quality assurance processes and systems in the PhD education, looking at completions, but also looking at ethical requirements for projects as well as supervisor-supervisee relationships. How far the supervisor can actually ask you to do certain things. What is the norm? Can they ask you to write a literature review for them, for a paper, and not put you as a co-author? If the system has no rules, they can easily do. They are taking time away from your PhD, but they are the supervisor, and therefore there's nothing you can do about it. They manage that relationship. And you need to understand that what has changed is that from a top to bottom management of the relationship, all these measures have now introduced a much more balanced approach where you also need to manage that relationship and you need to set expectations from your supervisors. So this is where we have specific content of supervision rules and guidelines. So is there a maximum number of doctoral candidates? Is there any obligatory training for supervisors? As you go down that list, you go that way, and this is from the European Universities Association study. The link is at the bottom there. It's being hidden by the template, but it's an active link, where what they did is they looked through the different frameworks in Europe. What is the content of those frameworks? And obviously, almost 50% plus of those systems had a maximum number of doctoral candidates per supervisor. What is the appropriate number for someone, of students for someone? Can you supervise 10 students? I had a colleague of mine supervising 10 students at some point. You won't be able to do anything else. Not academically, but even in your family. 10 PhD students is a huge number. And if each one of them is fighting for their fair share of time, that's it. There's nothing else you could do with your day. Less systems are requiring an obligatory training for supervisors. Bear in mind that with your supervisors, we will take them through a session where we will tell them, well, not how to supervise you, but what we will tell them is we will tell them the opportunities they have as supervisors to help you develop those skills. So we told you what the opportunities are today. We will do exactly the same with your supervisors. So when a supervisor, you go and tell them, look, this is this conference I want to attend, or this training, I'll use my RTSG. The supervisor won't go, what's that? What's that acronym? What is RTSG? And then you won't have to explain to them, RTSG is something that SENSS is offering as part of our studentship. So all these things will be there for your supervisors as well. And the plan is that you make advantage of the opportunities. So the historical model of a single supervisor working with research students, with a single line of responsibility and the risks that has come with are no longer there. We're talking about supervisory teams working within a very formal framework of training and development an individual for their career goals. That's what the normal PhD is like. So you won't end up with a committee. PhD Comics will be a very good friend of yours in the next few years, where you have your professor, simultaneously your biggest ally and your worst enemy, first to suggest you do more work, the guru, only here for the free cookies. The adversary, bitter rivalry with the professor in the department. They always fight. The strawman woman, nice guy, no opinions. And the assistant professor still doesn't believe just a few months ago they were on the other side just like you, pretends to be an adult, and none of them will actually read your entire thesis. So we're trying to avoid that kind of model where nobody has the responsibility of training you and helping you and supporting you identifying what skills and what needs you have. And this is why Mark earlier, I hope he made the point that no single PhD journey will be exactly the same. No single management of the relationship between the supervisor and the supervisee will be exactly the same. Every single pair or every single triad or quartet, if depends on how many supervisors you've got. Some of you've got your 2 supervisors plus your collaborative partner supervisor. No quartet will be exactly the same in the way that relationship works and the way that relationship develops over the years. So, we moved away from these traditionally individual programs. We've got a doctoral curricula, and the doctoral studies take place within institutional structures, your graduate schools, your doctoral college, and doctoral training centers. So what I want you to do in your small tables, spend a few minutes on the implications of these developments for your research supervision and your supervisor-supervisee relationship. So I want you to discuss and think, what does it mean? What do you expect? Almost as if you were trying to think, what are your expectations from your supervisor in that journey? Okay? And get someone to very quickly report back on the discussion you were having. Okay? So if I want to summarize, what are your expectations from your supervisors? Anybody who has any burning things they want to share with us?
Honesty and transparency.
Honesty and transparency. If the supervisor, it's better to hear from your supervisor that things are going wrong than actually hear it from a reviewer. Okay? And the supervisors should be able to do it in a more gentle way. One expectation.
To be approachable.
Approachable, open, that's absolutely fine. You need to be able, otherwise, you're not talking the same language. We're not living in ivory towers. One expectation from that table?
Constructive collaboration.
Okay, constructive collaboration. I like the C, constructive collaboration words. So they shouldn't be telling you things that, it's not about pleasing your ears, it's about telling you the truth and what you need to be doing. Or sometimes, one of the things you asked me earlier about what do I enjoy, what do you get out, this intellectual debate with someone that has a command of the literature, and you see them as someone who can challenge you around your knowledge. That table back there?
To just take with a pinch of salt, but assist, not insist.
Okay. That's probably a lot of salt there. And final table?
We said that our supervisors have got such incredible knowledge that it's nice for us to be able to sort of suggest something, and they can say, "Oh, have you thought about this?" So like a two-way suggestion and listening relationship.
And the supervisors don't hold the divine wisdom. Okay, it's not that what we say is always there, and it's there to be challenged. Everything in the academic world is there to be challenged. That's the nature of the game. So, in order to think about the supervisor-supervisee relationship, you also need to think about what you want to get out of the PhD. And in reality, there are 3 purposes that people pursue PhDs. First of all is instrumental purposes. You want to develop a career, and depending on what type of career you want to develop, or you want to switch career, what type of career you want to switch to, you come into the PhD to get that training. There are the intellectual purposes, the personal interest, the satisfaction, the challenging. I always use this example. You build this big data set, you put it into your econometric software. I tend to use Stata. It's Friday night, 11 o'clock in the evening, and the question is, do you hit the enter button and look at the command and get the first results, or do you switch off your computer and say, I'm tired, I'll look at it tomorrow? And most of the time, researchers that have a passion, they will say, okay, I'll hit that enter button and see what results I'm getting out of that. And of course, altruistic purposes like solving problems, enable changing, benefiting others, we all have those. And these are not mutually exclusive. You could have all three of them at the same time, but it's about what I always say is I use this slide when I do my workshops for potential applicants, and I say to them, look, use them in your motivation letter. And what I say to you is use those purposes, reflect on those purposes in those dark, rainy nights of your PhD, because they will get you back to the reset point. Why am I doing this one? And that's why am I doing it, and this is what I want to achieve, and you get inspiration from that. So, what are supervisors' models of supervision? And I've got the reference list at the end, so if anybody wants to read more about them, feel free to go. They can be a number of different things that the supervisor could do. They could be simply functional. They could be enculturation, critical thinking, emancipation, relationship development, and you've got the supervisor activity and the supervisor knowledge and skills. So you might need to start thinking, what do I want to get? And this is why I ask you to think about expectations. What do I need to get from my supervisor? And ask your supervisor to provide you with that guidance. So it's very different from someone that has a very functional type of supervisor, which has a very clear plan laid out for the student. They say, this is what you need to be doing. You're doing your literature review now. This is the literature you need to follow. Directing is almost like a project management type of supervisor. And, the student reaction, you need to have a very obedient and very organized student. But on the other hand, if you've got a student who's, someone with a constant inquiry, fight or flight type of model, and you try to have this functional approach, you will fail. So this is why I said no to pairs or no to quartets or triplets are the same, because you have very different approaches from the student and very different approaches from the supervisor. And one of the things I usually find out, and this is why I want to plant the seed now, is that most of the time the students themselves don't know what they want. So you need to think about your own learning model, draw from your experiences so far, not only academic life experiences, think about the way you learn. So it's more about thinking who you are as an individual, as a student, as a doctoral researcher, and then try to explain that to your supervisor as well. And trust me, supervisors can adapt. I had a story very recently with a student. I was telling them something and they couldn't understand what I was telling them because we were not communicating in the same way. The student wanted me to tell them exactly what to do, and I basically was leaving space for them to think. It's almost like a cultural class there where, some cultures need to have a far more direct approach to what they do, and some cultures, and if you don't do that, they go like, oh, what am I supposed to do now? And some cultures, they are very happy to have that open space where they can grow into. So unless you know what you want, you won't be able to communicate that to your supervisor. And that's a crucial aspect of managing that relationship. And then, of course, it's the purpose and the pedagogy. The supervisor view is, enable student to become self-sufficient as a researcher, enable student to produce innovative research, but also to develop as an individual. So there are three layers there: the personal development, the ideas development, the skills development. There was this discussion at one of the tables at the back where they were looking at the supervisor as a mentor. It's someone that you have, a lifetime relationship with, that you could go back to them, and ask them their advice. What do I need to do? My supervisor is at least the vast majority of them still come back to me asking, I'm thinking about doing that, I'm thinking about doing that with my career, with my life, what is your advice? And I tell them my honest view. If they want to take it, they take it. If they don't want, I don't mind. So you've got these very different models, hierarchical, master apprentice or master slave, supervisory styles, legitimate peripheral participation, mentor advisor on a journey, coaching, service contract, work professional training, all these models, metaphors of the relationship between the supervisor and supervisee that you can go and read more if you want in the references. And it is clear what is clear, if you forget about everything I've said over the last hour, it's really, really important to have or establish, if you haven't done already, a code of communication with your supervisor and set up those expectations as early as possible. And I'm hoping that in the process of developing your proposal, you have already done that. So you end up in a situation like this one. I'll be out of the country for the next 5 months, Stagel. My location will be unknown and my internet access will be sporadic, so I may not reply to your emails. I also won't be able to read your drafts or answer any questions face to face. In other words, it will be as if I never left. I miss you already. And I have someone back there saying, oh, I've sent an email to my supervisor and I got an out of office reply because they're on sabbatical, and I thought they're going to disappear. And in reality, no, they're not going to disappear. They'll still be there, but it's a different management process of their time and your time with them, even when they are on sabbatical. Or, of course, you go to the other one, which is, meeting of the minds. He's totally on to me. He knows I've done nothing this week. I can see it in his disapproving eyes. He thinks I'm worthless. Squash game with Professor Jones today, that old bugger. Which reminds me, got to pick up the dry cleaning. And what's this guy's name again? Right? So a very typical supervisor-supervisee meeting in these days. Right. Let me say that in reality, you've got kind of 4 different styles there. And again, the quicker you realize which of those fits your relationship, depends on the amount of support you give and the amount of structure. And if you've got someone that doesn't give you any support or any structure, is more of a laissez-faire, as long as you're happy with that and you're fine to work on your own and just check in with them, it's absolutely fine. And then you've got the interventionist supervisor, which is someone that provides a lot of support and a lot of guidance and a lot of structure to you, which again, if you need that. Sometimes, if I had at any point an interventionalist supervisor, I would struggle because I don't want someone to tell me what I want to do. I want to have the flexibility and the availability to work with my own deadlines, to do what I'm supposed to be doing and deliver on that. I was lucky and unlucky enough to have a supervisor who was a lot of laissez-faire, go and do what you like. And equally, that relationship might change over the years. So you might need a bit more of an interventionalist now and a bit more of a laissez-faire later on in your studies as you develop as an individual. Again, that's something that you need to discuss with them. We're not magicians. We're not kind of fortune tellers. We're not in your minds as supervisors. I can't read minds. Okay? If you don't tell me, I won't know. Okay? And that's quite important. These things could actually lead to a number of different outcomes, depending on the way you work and the way the supervisor works, to the ideal, which is an autonomy generation. You become eventually a researcher, but there are cases where you might see possible conflict there if your supervisor style and your style of learning are very different. The thing I'm trying to say here is talk to each other as early as possible if you identify that these are kind of cases where you might have different needs from what your supervisor is kindly offering you. And I'll close with this one, going back to the discussion about the pleasures and the risks of supervision. So There is the relationship between the supervisor and the student, and that's, you know, the institutionally prescribed relationship. It's from Grant. Institutionally prescribed relations with stable positions. Where I think issues start to emerge is that in reality that relationship has to bear some fruit. It's nice to have a relationship, but that relationship has to bear some fruit, and that fruit is the thesis that you need to produce eventually. And this is where you start getting into issues, because the second layer, you know, changes the relationship. It's not about we're having a friendly relationship or we're having a general relationship. It's about a relationship that needs to lead to something. And the minute you put that into a relationship, in any human relationship, the minute you develop a goal, the rules change. So this is where the thesis is creating the complexity. And then not only that, but you could have the case where the supervisor and the student and the thesis might be in very different positions as socials. So the supervisor, the thesis, and the student have not only, you know, a triangular linear relationship where I know my supervisor knows me and my thesis, but these things can change over time, but they could also change because your approach to things and your approach to reality can be very different. So you might be seeing things in a slightly different perspective. You know, if you've got a supervisor who's thinking about an academic career and you haven't communicated, actually, I don't want an academic career, and they're pushing you to that, you've got a conflict. Okay? So that's really, really important. And then, of course, you've got, you know, the unconscious desires in that relationship, where you might have other things that you want to achieve throughout the PhD. You know, you have other things in your mind, you've got other realities that might be influencing you, you know. And again, you need to explain those things to your supervisor as early as possible in order for them to understand where you are. You know, I've had a student that suffered from long COVID. They didn't tell me about it until it was probably quite late. And not only from my perspective, what I was seeing is a student that wasn't performing well. Little did I know that the poor chap had cloud mind because of long COVID. We never had that discussion. And I said, I couldn't tell. The only thing I could tell from my supervisor, it was a deterioration of the quality of the work I was receiving, and an inability to incorporate my feedback. From their side, they couldn't do it because they had a medical condition. So talk about those things with your supervisor as early as possible, and be honest with the supervisor in that relationship. There is no point of us standing here and telling you, you know, we live in these ivory towers and everything is great and everything will be great and don't worry. What I'm saying is there is a kind of constructive cooperation. In order for that constructive cooperation to exist, there is another word starting with C that is actually very important in that relationship, and that word is communication. So keep that as a guiding principle to whatever you do with your supervisor. Communication, communication, communication. Thank you.